The airport loudspeaker blared its final boarding call, a metallic echo that cut through the hustle of travelers. At gate D-17, everyone was rushing past with their coffee cups, rolling suitcases, and impatient glances. But one man did not move. Dr. Malcolm Price, seated in first class, calm and unshakable, was about to face something far greater than flight delays or demanding passengers. He looked like any ordinary businessman, but his presence sparked a silent tension. Why was he being questioned? Why was his very existence in that seat suddenly a problem? Was it just a mistake, or something far darker? As passengers whispered and phones recorded, the cabin transformed into a microcosm of society itself, where dignity, justice, and prejudice collided at 30,000 feet. In this story, we follow Malcolm's quiet courage, his unwavering dignity, and the ripple effects of standing firm in the face of bias. What would you do if your humanity were questioned in front of the world? Hit like, share, and subscribe to join us as we unfold this gripping story of courage, justice, and the fight against discrimination in the skies. The airport loudspeaker cracked overhead, its metallic tone echoing through the cavernous terminal like the strike of a gavel. Final boarding call for Horizon Air Flight 417 to San Francisco. Passengers, please proceed to gate D-17. Travelers hurried past with rolling suitcases, coffee cups sloshing, shoulders brushing in the endless current of departure. But one man did not rush. He moved with a quiet, steady grace that contrasted with the chaos around him. Dr. Malcolm Price was not a man most passengers would recognize. He wore a simple charcoal suit, polished but understated, and carried a leather briefcase darkened from years of use. His salt and pepper hair was cropped close, his expression calm, almost detached. To the others in line, he looked like an ordinary business traveler trying to make it home. What they could not see, what none of them could imagine, was that this man had the power to decide the fate of the very airline they were about to board. With a single call, a single signature, he could finalize or destroy a $500 million deal with Horizon Air. But at gate D-17, Malcolm Price was just another passenger with a boarding pass in his pocket. He stepped forward when the scanner beeped green, handed back his pass with a polite nod, and walked the jet bridge. The hum of engines seeped through the walls, steady and low, like the pulse of a giant heart waiting to take flight. Inside the cabin, first class was quiet, cocooned from the noise of economy. The wide leather seats gleamed under soft lighting, pillows perfectly angled, glasses already waiting on polished trays. Malcolm set his briefcase into the overhead bin, lowered himself into seat 1A, and exhaled. For him, air travel was rarely restful. Airports had a way of dredging up memories he wished would stay buried. He opened his briefcase and pulled out a small notebook, the leather worn smooth from years of handling. On the first page, written in bold black letters, a single word stared back at him: justice. He traced the letters with his finger, grounding himself. That word had guided him through boardrooms and backrooms, through victories and humiliations. Justice was the compass he never allowed to slip from his hand. Around him, first-class passengers settled in with the practiced ease of people accustomed to privilege. A man in a navy suit snapped open his laptop, the glow reflecting off his platinum loyalty tag. A woman in designer sunglasses ordered sparkling water before the cabin door had even closed. Malcolm remained still, his notebook resting on his lap, his gaze turned toward the small oval window. For a moment, Everything was calm. The soft shuffle of shoes on carpet, the faint clink of ice in glasses, the polite murmur of greetings from the flight attendants. But beneath that calm, Malcolm felt something else, the weight of a silence that always seemed to follow him in places like this. A silence that wasn't quite neutral, but heavy, like the pause before a storm. He had felt it at golf clubs, where the staff asked twice for his membership card. He had felt it at luxury hotels, where receptionists checked his ID longer than anyone else's. He had felt it in boardrooms, where colleagues questioned his authority even as they signed deals worth billions. And now, as he sat in 1A, he felt it again, that quiet, questioning gaze that lingered longer than it should. He closed his eyes briefly, inhaling. His father's voice returned, clear as if the man were sitting beside him. Don't raise your voice in a world that already screams. Let your silence carry the weight of your truth. Malcolm had built his life on that lesson, but silence was not always enough. He knew it, and something in the air told him silence might soon be tested. The cabin door closed with a hollow thud. A flight attendant made her way down the aisle, smiling brightly at passengers, straightening headrests, checking seat belts. Her uniform was crisp, her blonde hair pulled into a tight bun. Her name tag read Heather Collins. When she reached the first row, her smile faltered. She glanced at Malcolm, then at the seating chart on her tablet. Her eyes narrowed just slightly. She approached, her voice polite but clipped. "Excuse me, sir," she said, her tone measured. "This seat is reserved. I'll need to ask you to move to economy." Malcolm opened his eyes, meeting her gaze. There was no anger in his look, only calm that unsettled her for a moment. Without a word, he reached into his jacket, drew out his boarding pass, and held it up. Heather studied the slip of paper. The name was clear. The seat number, bold 1A, everything was valid. Still, she hesitated, her lips pressing into a thin line. She murmured. I'll need to double-check this." Malcolm said nothing. He closed his notebook, his fingers still resting on the word justice. That touch was like an oath, silent but unshakable. Across the aisle, a man in his early 50s leaned forward. His suit was sharp, his cufflinks glinting under the overhead light. Around his neck hung a lanyard with a Platinum Elite card that he flaunted like a badge of honor. "That's my seat," the man announced, his voice carrying easily through the cabin. "I've flown this route every month for 10 years. He's in the wrong place. Heads turned. A few passengers exchanged curious glances. The man's confidence, the authority in his tone, made his claim sound official. Malcolm remained still, his gaze steady, his voice low but firm. "The pass says 1A. My name is on it. This is my seat." The man smirked, as though humored by the protest. "Yeah, sure, we'll see about that." Heather shifted uncomfortably, torn between procedure and perception. For an instant, she felt the pressure of every watching eye. Her training told her to de-escalate, to move swiftly before conflict grew. Yet something else, something unspoken, tilted her judgment. She looked at Malcolm as though his presence required more proof than paper. From the second row, a young woman with curly dark hair pulled out her phone. She spoke softly into the camera, her voice trembling but resolute. "There's discrimination happening right in front of me. Do you see this?" Her name was Maya Lopez, a law student traveling alone. She had learned in class that truth rarely speaks for itself. It needs witnesses. and in that moment, she decided she would be one. The cabin grew heavier, like air thickening before a thunderstorm. Some passengers turned back to their newspapers, pretending not to notice. Others leaned closer, sensing something bigger than a seating dispute. Bradley Turner, the platinum card holder, leaned back in his seat, a satisfied grin spreading across his face. "Let's not drag this out," he said loudly, for everyone to hear. "People like him don't belong here. Move along. We need to fly." The words landed sharp and cold, ripping the thin veil of politeness that usually governed first class. Malcolm drew a slow breath. His father's voice echoed again. His memories clawed forward. The endless moments of being told to prove himself, the humiliation hidden under procedure. Always the same script: prove you belong, but not this time. He lifted his gaze, his voice calm but weighted with iron. "Is it the color of my skin that makes you believe I don't belong in this seat?" The cabin froze. The storm had begun. The silence after Malcolm's words was heavy, like a courtroom where the jury had been struck dumb. Every passenger within earshot shifted uneasily in their seats. Some looked down at magazines they weren't really reading, while others stared openly at the man in 1A, waiting for what would happen next. Heather Collins, the flight attendant, adjusted her scarf, her professional smile trembling. She had dealt with angry passengers before, had calmed people who screamed over delays or demanded upgrades. But this was different. This man wasn't shouting. He wasn't threatening. He wasn't even moving. He sat still, hands folded on the notebook in his lap, and that stillness unnerved her more than any raised voice. She tried to reassert control. "Sir," she said, clearing her throat, "this isn't about the color of your skin. It's just that this seat has been flagged. I'll need to verify the payment card used for this ticket." Malcolm met her eyes, unblinking. His voice was calm, low enough that the quiet made everyone lean in to catch it. "Do you ask that of every passenger in first class, or only me?" Heather hesitated, her mouth open, but no words forming. For the briefest moment, guilt flickered in her eyes before she pressed it down. She knew people were watching, and the cameras made her skin prickle. The young woman in 2B, Maya Lopez, tilted her phone slightly to capture the exchange. Bradley Turner, still standing near his own bag, seized the opportunity. He puffed out his chest, holding his platinum card between two fingers like a weapon. "This is ridiculous," he said. "I've been a loyal customer for more than a decade. Everyone knows me on this route. I should be sitting there. He must have mixed something up." Malcolm did not flinch. He opened his boarding pass again, set it on the armrest where anyone could see, and let the silence do the talking. His name was clear. The seat number was printed boldly 1A. The proof was undeniable, yet somehow not enough. Passengers glanced at the ticket, then at Bradley, then back at Malcolm. The truth was obvious, but the question in the air was louder: whose word would the airline trust? Maya whispered into her phone. The glow of her live stream casting a faint light on her face. "Do you see this? His boarding pass is right there, but it's still not enough for them." Her voice shook, not from fear but from anger. Heather straightened her shoulders, as if reminding herself she was the authority in this cabin. "Sir, please understand," she said, raising her voice slightly. "When there's a discrepancy, it's our duty to resolve it. If you could just cooperate and move while we sort this out." Malcolm closed his notebook gently. his hand still resting on the cover where the word justice pressed through the leather. "You're asking me to surrender my seat when my documents are in order, while another passenger claims it without proof, and you call that procedure." Bradley laughed loudly, breaking the tension with a sound that grated like metal. "Procedure? Exactly. Don't make this about race, man. This is about standards. First class isn't for everyone. It's for people who've earned it." The words cut through the air. The last line hung especially heavy. "It's for people who've earned it." Dorothy Hayes, an older woman in row 3, lowered her magazine. She had been watching quietly, her silver hair falling neatly around her face, her expression controlled. Now her eyes sharpened. She looked at Bradley, then at Heather, then at Malcolm. Her lips pressed together as if she were holding something back, but not for long. "I've been sitting here the whole time," Dorothy said, her voice firm. "That man showed his boarding pass. He's in the right seat. If you can't see that, the problem isn't with him." The cabin rustled. Whispers flowed between passengers. Some nodded. Others looked uncomfortable, caught between truth and fear of getting involved. Heather's cheeks flushed. She hadn't expected another passenger to speak up. Her training told her to stay professional, but her authority was slipping away like sand through fingers. She tapped the screen of her tablet again, as if the technology could rescue her. "I'll need to contact the gate supervisor," she muttered. "This isn't resolved." Bradley smirked, sinking into seat 1C as though victory were inevitable. He leaned back, arms crossed, and addressed no one in particular. "Trust me, they'll move him. This airline knows its priorities." Malcolm took a slow breath. He thought of his father again, of the many times they had been told to wait, to step aside, to swallow indignity in silence. He remembered the look in his father's eyes after being turned away from a club he had every right to enter. Pride wounded but not destroyed. A lesson passed down silence can be stronger than rage, but as Malcolm sat in 1A, that lesson felt heavier than ever. Silence had preserved him, but silence had also allowed others to continue believing their prejudice was normal. Was it enough to sit still, or was this the moment to speak in a way that could not be ignored? Maya's phone chimed softly. Her live stream comments were exploding. Words scrolled so quickly she couldn't read them all. "Keep filming. Don't stop. We see this. Show his ticket again. This is wrong." She glanced at Malcolm. His composure amazed her. He didn't fidget, didn't raise his voice. He looked like a man carved from stone, every breath measured. She realized that if he cracked, even slightly, the airline would twist it as evidence of disruption. But if he remained calm, the weight of truth would fall on them. Not him. Heather's voice came back, sharper now, as she pressed her radio. "Control. This is Collins in first class. I need a gate supervisor at once. Passenger non-compliant. Possible seat dispute." Malcolm closed his eyes briefly, his hand brushing the edge of the notebook. Justice. The word reminded him of something his father once whispered in a moment of despair. "One day, son, you'll be forced to decide if justice is worth the fight. That day will come when everyone else expects you to give up. You'll know it when it arrives." He knew it now. Dorothy looked across the aisle at him, her expression kind but fierce. "Don't give in," she whispered, her voice low enough that only he and Maya heard. "We're watching. The world is watching." Maya raised her phone a little higher, her hand trembling. She whispered to her viewers, "They just called in security. This is escalating." Bradley leaned back with a satisfied sigh. "Good," he muttered. "Maybe now we can get this flight moving." Malcolm opened his eyes and spoke quietly, but his words carried through the cabin. "If they want to call security, let them, but let it be clear to everyone here, and everyone watching, what they are calling security for. Not for disruption, not for danger, but for doubt. Doubt rooted in something no ticket, no document, will ever erase in their eyes." Heather froze, her radio still in hand. Bradley scoffed, rolling his eyes, but Maya's live stream caught every syllable. Her audience surged. Comments flooded. "This is powerful. He's right. Don't back down." "No justice in seat OA." The plane had not yet left the ground, but already it felt like it was carrying a storm. The passengers were no longer just travelers. They were witnesses. And Malcolm Price, still seated in 1A, had become the center of a story none of them would forget. The sound of Heather's radio request still hung in the air when silence fell back over the cabin. It was not the comfortable silence of travelers preparing for a long flight, but the brittle quiet of people waiting for a verdict. The passengers in first class no longer hid behind their newspapers or pretended to sleep. Their eyes shifted between Malcolm Price, still seated firmly in 1A, and Bradley Turner, who sat smugly across the aisle as though the seat already belonged to him. Malcolm leaned back slightly, his posture relaxed but deliberate. Every movement seemed measured, purposeful, as though he knew that dozens of eyes and at least one camera phone were recording his every breath. He had faced boardrooms full of hostile executives and politicians bristling with skepticism. But this was different. This was not a contract dispute. This was not about numbers. This was about who was allowed to sit, who was allowed to exist without being questioned. Heather Collins paced a few feet away, her polished heels clicking against the carpet. She tried to maintain her composure, but her hands betrayed her, tightening into fists at her side. She glanced down at her tablet again, scrolling as though she might find some technical explanation that would justify what she had already set in motion. There was none. The manifest showed clearly Dr. Malcolm Price. Seat 1A, confirmed. Yet she still couldn't shake the gnawing discomfort that somehow his presence disrupted the order of the cabin. Maya Lopez, seated in 2B, adjusted her phone discreetly. Her live stream had climbed past 5,000 viewers, and the comments flooded faster than she could read them. People were demanding proof. She angled the phone to catch the boarding pass that Malcolm had placed on the armrest. His name printed clearly, the seat unambiguous. She whispered into her mic, her tone urgent. "There it is. Seat 1A, paid, confirmed." And still they question him. Still they treat him like he doesn't belong. Bradley Turner leaned forward, clasping his hands together as though he were presiding over a meeting. He addressed Heather with the confidence of someone used to being obeyed. "Look, Heather, you're wasting everyone's time. He's not supposed to be here. I fly this route every month. I always sit in one of the first row seats. Just move him back. Check the record later. The rest of us shouldn't have to wait." Malcolm turned his head slowly, his eyes locking on Bradley's. His voice was calm, but each word struck with precision. "You've flown this route many times, you say? Then you should know the rules as well as anyone. A boarding pass is the rule, and mine is valid." Bradley smirked. "It's not just about the paper. It's about trust. Status matters here. People know me. No one knows you." Dorothy Hayes in the row 3 let out a sharp breath, shaking her head. Status doesn't matter when the proof is right in front of us. You think your loyalty card gives you more right than his paid ticket. Bradley waved a hand dismissively, but the smugness on his face faltered for the first time. Dorothy's voice carried the weight of decades, the authority of someone who had seen too much to be swayed by arrogance. Heather stepped in again, her voice rising with forced confidence. "Let's not escalate this further. Sir, please, if you could just cooperate by moving until we verify." Malcolm raised an eyebrow, his tone unyielding. "And who will take my place in this seat while you verify him?" He nodded toward Bradley. "You would move me out and place him here, though he's shown nothing, provided nothing, only claimed entitlement. Tell me, Ms. Collins, is that procedure?" Her throat tightened. She opened her mouth, then closed it, unable to form a convincing answer. For the first time, the doubt she had projected onto Malcolm reflected back on her. Maya spoke softly to her phone, but her words were clear enough for the rows around her to hear. "This is how it works. Procedure becomes a mask. They demand more proof from one man while another is believed without question. This isn't about tickets. This is about bias." Bradley shifted in his seat, clearly irritated. "Are we really doing this? Turning a simple mix-up into some kind of civil rights lecture? We just need to move on. He doesn't fit the profile of a first-class passenger. That's obvious to everyone." The phrase landed like a slap. Doesn't fit the profile. Whispers rippled across the cabin. A few passengers gasped. Others shifted uncomfortably, aware that they had just heard prejudice laid bare in the rawest terms. Malcolm's hand brushed against the cover of his notebook again. Justice. His heart pounded, but his voice remained even. "You say I don't fit the profile. Tell me, Mr. Turner, what does that profile look like, and why does my presence violate it?" Bradley's smirk faltered. His eyes darted away for the first time, as though suddenly aware of how many cameras were pointed toward him. He tried to recover with a laugh, but it came out brittle, forced. Heather looked between them, her nerves fraying. She felt the control of the cabin slipping further with every passing moment. She pressed her radio again, speaking quickly. "Control. Confirm supervisors on the way. We need resolution at first class immediately." The cabin grew restless. The murmurs swelled, blending into a low wave of noise. Some passengers shook their heads in disapproval of Bradley's words. Others whispered about delays, about lawsuits, about what would happen if security arrived. Dorothy leaned forward again, her voice steady. "Mr. Price has done nothing wrong. If you force him to move, then the problem isn't his. It's yours." Maya raised her phone higher, her live stream viewers climbing past 10,000. The scrolling comments filled her screen. "Stand strong. We see you. Don't let them push him out." "Justice in seat." Malcolm remained still, unflinching, his eyes fixed ahead. Inside, a war raged. Part of him longed to avoid the spectacle, to give up the seat and retreat into anonymity. But another part, the part that remembered his father's eyes and the countless indignities swallowed in silence, told him this moment was different. This was not just about one seat on one flight. This was about every silent surrender that had come before. His inner voice steadied him. If you yield now, you prove them right. If you remain, you prove them wrong. Not just for yourself, but for everyone who has ever been told to move without reason. Heather cleared her throat, her voice shaking. "Sir, this is your final opportunity to comply before security arrives." Malcolm turned his head toward her, his gaze unwavering. "And what reason will you give them that a man with a valid ticket sat in his seat and refused to move because another passenger thought he didn't belong? Write it that way. Let them read it. Let them say it out loud." The tension in the cabin tightened like a rope pulled taut. Passengers looked between the three figures, the calm man in 1A, the flustered attendant, the arrogant loyalist. They felt the weight of history in the air, as if this small cabin had become a stage for something far larger than a seating dispute. Bradley muttered under his breath, but loud enough to be heard. People like him always play the victim card. Maya gasped softly, catching the words on her live stream. "You heard that, everyone," she whispered fiercely. "You heard it with your own ears. This isn't about policy. This is prejudice, naked and unashamed." The comments exploded across her screen. Viewers demanded accountability. Screenshots spread instantly across social media, and hashtags multiplied. The incident that had begun as a quiet confrontation was already turning into a viral storm. Malcolm sat straighter, clasped his hands together, and fastened his seatbelt with a deliberate click. The sound was small but final, echoing through the silence like a declaration. He spoke clearly, his voice calm yet heavy. "Call them, Ms. Collins. Call security. If I stand today, then tomorrow any one of you could be forced to stand, and I will not surrender that right." The hush that followed was absolute. For the first time, Bradley Turner had no comeback. Heather's hand trembled as she held her radio. The storm had broken, and the passengers knew they were no longer flying in anonymity. They were witnesses to something that would not stay contained within this cabin. The cabin vibrated with a tension that seemed to hum through the leather seats and polished metal fixtures. No one reached for their magazines anymore. No one pretended to nap. Every passenger in first class felt the electricity in the air, as though lightning was about to strike inside the narrow space of the aircraft. Heather Collins kept her radio gripped tightly, her knuckles white. She tried to steady her breathing, to remember her training de-escalation, authority, procedure, but nothing in her manuals had prepared her for a man like Dr. Malcolm Price, who did not need to raise his voice to command the entire cabin. His stillness was unnerving, his refusal a mirror that reflected every insecurity back on her. "From 2B," Maya Lopez whispered into her phone, the glow of her live stream catching her determined expression. "They called security," she told her growing audience. "Now, more than 20,000 strong. He hasn't moved, hasn't raised his voice, hasn't broken a rule, and yet here we are. Watch what happens next. Don't look away." Bradley Turner, still radiating smug entitlement, leaned back in seat 1C. He stretched his legs as if the matter had already been decided in his favor. "Good," he muttered to Heather, loud enough for others to hear. "Now we can get this flight going once they drag him out." Malcolm did not respond. He sat straight, his boarding pass still on the armrest, his notebook closed on his lap. His hand rested gently on the cover where the word justice lay beneath his fingertips. Inside, his thoughts churned. He remembered countless moments like this, moments when giving in had seemed easier. But each time he had yielded, each time he had chosen silence, the burden had grown heavier. His father's words echoed inside him again. "There will come a day when your silence will no longer protect you. You'll know it when it arrives." The sound of footsteps broke the silence, heavy, deliberate, echoing through the jet bridge. The murmurs hushed instantly. Then the sharp rhythm of heels clicked against the cabin floor. All eyes turned toward the aisle. Susan Miller, the gate supervisor, strode into first class with a rigid posture and an electronic clipboard clutched in her hand. At her side, 2 uniformed security officers followed, their presence dark and commanding. Officer Daniels, broad-shouldered with a lined face, scanned the cabin with practiced caution. Officer Wright, younger but tense, rested a hand near his radio as if bracing for confrontation. Heather exhaled in relief, as though reinforcements had arrived to save her. She stepped forward quickly, gesturing toward Malcolm. "This passenger has refused to comply with my instructions," she explained, her voice loud enough for everyone to hear. "He is occupying seat 1A but has not provided the required verification. I need him removed immediately so we can depart." The officers looked toward Malcolm. What they saw was not what Heather's report had suggested. He sat calmly, seatbelt fastened, hands resting on his lap, no sign of aggression or intoxication. His gaze was steady, his voice low but clear. "I have a valid ticket," Malcolm said, nodding to the pass on the armrest. "My documents are in order. I've caused no disruption. I've broken no rule. So tell me, how exactly am I failing to cooperate?" The question cut through the air like a blade. Passengers shifted in their seats, eyes darting between the supervisor, the officers, and the man in 1A who seemed more composed than anyone else in the cabin. Susan Miller frowned, scanning the boarding pass herself. The name matched the manifest. The seat number was correct. There was no irregularity she could point to, no obvious justification for removal. And yet Heather's expectation weighed on her. She could feel Bradley Turner's eyes boring into her, demanding resolution in his favor. He refused to show the payment card. Heather pressed quickly, as though clinging to the one thread she had left. That's the rule when suspicion arises. Malcolm tilted his head slightly, his eyes locking onto hers. And what suspicion justified it? "Did you ask this man?" He nodded toward Bradley for his card. The cabin froze. Dozens of eyes turned to Bradley. His face flushed red. He forced a chuckle, his arrogance faltering. "That's different. I'm Platinum Elite. I've flown this route for years. Everyone knows me." Malcolm's voice deepened, resonant and unyielding. "And me. Because I don't look like the person you expect in this seat. I'm forced to prove more. That is not procedure. That is prejudice." The words rang like a verdict. A few passengers gasped softly. Dorothy Hayes, seated in row 3, spoke up with a trembling voice but firm conviction. "He's right. I've been here the whole time. He has shown his ticket. He has done nothing wrong. Maya's live stream viewers surged past 50,000. She whispered fiercely into her mic. "You hear it? You see it? The truth is right here. They can't hide it anymore." Officer Daniels shifted uncomfortably. He had seen his share of unruly passengers, drunken brawls, shouting matches. This was different. The man before him radiated calm, composure, dignity. Removing him would not look like security maintaining order. It would look like security enforcing injustice. Susan Miller straightened, her tone firm though, edged with unease. "Sir, if you do not vacate the seat, we will be forced to take action." Malcolm closed his eyes briefly, then tapped the cover of his notebook gently with one finger. Justice. He opened them again, sweeping his gaze across the cabin. I will not leave this seat, because if I stand today, then tomorrow any one of you could be forced to stand, not for breaking a rule, but for breaking someone's expectation. And I refuse to feed that silence any longer. The silence that followed was absolute. Every passenger in first class held their breath. Dorothy Hayes clutched the armrest of her seat, tears brimming in her eyes. Maya's hands shook as she held her phone, her voice breaking with emotion as she whispered to her audience. Did you hear that his words? This is history unfolding in front of us. Bradley slammed his hand on the armrest, his arrogance flaring in desperation. Enough of this. Let the flight depart. Drag him out if you must. A man like him demanding 1A is laughable. The passengers gasped. The words, dripping with contempt, landed like poison in the air. Maya zoomed her camera closer on Malcolm's face. Comments exploded across her screen. Unbelievable. He said that pure racism. Keep recording. Don't stop. Malcolm unfastened his seatbelt slowly. Every eye followed his movements, expecting surrender. But instead, he reached calmly into his jacket and withdrew a sleek black phone. He tapped the screen, then placed it on speaker. A male voice came through, clear and respectful. Dr. Price, the board is awaiting your final decision on the Horizon Air deal. Shall we proceed with the vote? Gasps rippled through the cabin. Susan Miller's face drained of color. Heather froze. Bradley's smugness shattered, replaced by sudden dread. Malcolm turned his gaze on Susan, his voice steady as stone. You asked how I was failing to cooperate. Now I ask you, do you know who it is you're trying to remove from seat 1A? The cabin erupted with whispers, the reality dawning like thunder. Cameras tilted. Passengers murmured in disbelief. Maya's livestream chat exploded, hashtags flashing across her screen. Malcolm Price sat tall, unflinching, his presence no longer just that of a passenger. He was a man holding the fate of the airline in his hand, and the storm that had been building inside first class had just broken into the open sky. Gasps spread through the cabin like a wave crashing against the shore. The voice on Malcolm Price's phone still echoed in the air, every word a revelation. A corporate board waiting for his signal. A $500 million deal hanging in the balance. The passengers who had wondered if this was just another dispute over seating now understood the stakes were far greater. Susan Miller's grip on her clipboard tightened, her fingers trembling. She had dealt with entitled travelers before, with complaints and demands, with tempers that flared. But she had never stood at the center of something like this. The man in seat 1A was not only dignified, but powerful. The calm in his voice was not weakness, but authority, and the realization twisted in her chest she had misjudged him from the moment she walked in. Heather Collins stared at Malcolm as though seeing him for the first time. The word prejudice echoed in her mind, bouncing against the fragile excuses she had built. She wanted to cling to procedure, to rules, to the safety of her training manual. But none of those words would erase what the passengers had already witnessed. She saw it in their eyes. Her authority was crumbling. Bradley Turner, however, refused to yield. He leaned forward, his face flushed, his voice dripping with disbelief. "Are you threatening us? Dr. Price, is that what this is, using your money to bully the airline?" Malcolm's gaze shifted slowly toward him. His tone was calm, even, but heavy as iron. "No, Mr. Turner, this is not a threat. This is a mirror reflecting the cost of contempt. You believe loyalty status buys you dignity. I am here to tell you dignity is not for sale. Not mine. Not anyone's." The cabin erupted into murmurs. Some passengers clapped softly, almost hesitantly, while others shook their heads in disbelief. Dorothy Hayes pressed a trembling hand to her chest, her eyes shining with tears. "He's right," she whispered to no one in particular. "God help me. He's right." Maya Lopez's phone vibrated in her hand, notifications exploding. Her live stream had passed 100,000 viewers. The comments scrolled too quickly to read. She focused on Malcolm's face, zooming closer, capturing every line of calm resolve. "Do you hear him?" she whispered into the mic. "This isn't just about one man. This is about all of us." Susan Miller cleared her throat, trying to reclaim control. "Dr. Price," she said, her voice softer but strained. "I'm sure we can resolve this matter without escalation. Perhaps if you would step aside briefly, we could?" Malcolm interrupted, his voice sharp but never raised. "Step aside. That is always the demand. Isn't it step aside? Wait. Prove yourself again and again. But tell me, Ms. Miller, when does the proving end? When does dignity become something you no longer have to earn every time you sit in a seat?" Her words caught in her throat. She had no answer. The silence stretched, heavy and condemning. Bradley slammed his fist against the armrest. "Enough of this charade. He's playing the victim, and you're all eating it up. This is first class, not some stage for speeches." Dorothy Hayes snapped her head toward him, her voice trembling but fierce. "First class, economy, it doesn't matter. Fairness matters. And I will not sit here and watch a man humiliated for the color of his skin while you gloat." Gasps filled the air. Some passengers nodded, their courage rising with hers. Others stayed silent but looked away, ashamed. Officer Daniels stepped forward. His voice was calm but resolute. "With respect. Miller, I see no grounds to remove this passenger. He has a valid ticket. He has caused no disruption. If we force him out, we risk making a mistake that cannot be undone." Officer Wright hesitated, then nodded in agreement. "I've seen plenty of passengers out of line. This isn't one of them. He's sitting quietly in his seat. That's not non-compliance. That's his right." Heather's breath caught. For the first time, even the officers were siding with the man she had singled out. The walls of authority she had relied on were collapsing one by one. Malcolm closed his phone calmly, the voice of the board disappearing, but the weight of its presence lingering. He placed it on his lap beside his notebook. Then he spoke slowly, clearly, for everyone to hear. "This is not about money. This is not about a contract. This is about truth. The truth that no amount of wealth, no title, no suit can protect a man when prejudice decides he does not belong. But dignity cannot be stripped by bias. It can only be surrendered, and I will not surrender mine." The words fell like thunder in the cabin. Passengers erupted into applause, some hesitant at first, then growing stronger, unified, unstoppable. Dorothy Hayes clapped through her tears. Maya's camera shook in her trembling hands as she narrated through sobs. "This is history. This is the moment the world will remember." Bradley's face twisted, his arrogance unraveling. He looked around, realizing the tide had turned. For the first time in years, his platinum card, his status, his privilege could not shield him. The power he had always assumed was his, by right, was crumbling in front of strangers, cameras, and the entire internet. Susan Miller swallowed hard. She stepped back, her authority collapsing under the weight of public judgment. "Dr. Price," she said quietly, on behalf of Horizon Air, "I apologize. What happened here does not reflect our values." Malcolm's eyes fixed on hers, calm but cutting. "Your apology whispered in the shadow cannot erase the humiliation carried out in the light. You did not only demean me, you demeaned every passenger who has ever been told they do not belong. Today, that silence ends." The applause swelled again, rolling through the cabin like a storm breaking across the sea. Phones lit up, recording every second, broadcasting to the world. Maya whispered through her tears, "He's not just sitting in 1A. He's sitting for all of us." Outside the cabin, in the control centers of Horizon Air, screens flashed red with crisis alerts. Stock tickers dipped sharply. Public relations officers shouted into phones. Executives scrambled for answers. The storm that began in first class was no longer confined to the aircraft. It was spilling across markets, newsrooms, and social platforms worldwide. But inside the cabin, Malcolm Price remained still, composed, dignified, his notebook closed on his lap, his phone silent, his eyes steady. He had not raised his voice. He had not stood to fight. He had only refused to move, and that refusal had shaken an entire system. Passengers knew the flight would depart eventually, that they would land hours later at their destination, but none of them would ever forget what had happened here. Because this was not just a flight. It had become a courtroom. And justice, at last, had been spoken aloud. The cabin felt like a courtroom. The walls of the aircraft transformed into a stage on which truth had been spoken aloud. Malcolm Price sat motionless, his phone silent, his notebook resting on his lap. The word justice glared from its cover like a commandment. Maya Lopez could barely keep her hand steady. Her phone vibrated nonstop, the comment section of her live stream filling with a blur of messages. The viewership counter blinked past 200,000, then 3. The world outside the plane had already entered the cabin. Every seat, every face, every word was under a magnifying glass. "Do you all see this?" Maya whispered hoarsely into her mic. He's sitting quietly, dignified, and yet they tried to force him out. This is prejudice, live, happening right here on Horizon Air. Her viewers responded in waves. "Stay strong, Malcolm. Dignity is not for sale. Justice in seat 1A." Hashtags multiplied across the chat feed, flooding the screen so quickly it looked like a storm. Dorothy Hayes dabbed her eyes with a handkerchief, her voice breaking as she spoke to the woman seated beside her. "I've lived 68 years, and I've seen a lot, but I never thought I'd see something like this. Not here, not in this time." Bradley Turner sat rigid, his once proud smirk gone. He fiddled with his platinum card, but it no longer felt like a badge of honor. It felt like a shackle, an emblem of arrogance exposed before the world. His phone buzzed in his pocket, message after message demanding his attention. But he dared not look. The comments from Maya's stream had already labeled him the face of privilege. Heather Collins leaned against the galley wall, her face pale. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw her own reflection in the dozens of cameras pointed her way. Her voice from minutes earlier echoed in her head like a verdict she wished she could take back. "You need to verify. You don't belong here." She tried to steady her breathing, but guilt pressed down heavy on her chest. Susan Miller attempted to regain control. her clipboard clutched tightly. She stepped forward, forcing a smile that fooled no one. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began, her voice wavering, "this situation is being resolved. Please remain calm. We will continue boarding shortly." But her words fell flat. The passengers had already seen too much. They knew they were not just on a flight. They were part of something larger. Cameras kept rolling. Whispers spread. Truth was being recorded in real time, and no corporate spin could erase it. Malcolm lifted his gaze, looking around the cabin. His voice carried without effort, quiet but resonant. The silence of others has always been the shield of prejudice. Today, silence is no longer an option. Applause rippled again through the cabin, stronger this time. Some passengers clapped, others nodded. Even those who had stayed quiet before now felt the pull of his words. They were no longer just travelers, they were witnesses. In Maya's live stream, the viewership counter leapt past 500,000. News agencies were joining the feed, reposting clips, blasting the story across social media. CNN, BBC, Reuters, their names flashed in the comments as their teams confirmed they were already rebroadcasting the footage. At Horizon Air headquarters in Chicago, a wall of screens lit up red with alerts. Stock tickers plunged as shares dipped 5%, then 8% within minutes. In the operations control room, the head of communications barked orders into a phone. "This is spreading like wildfire. Hashtags are trending worldwide. Justice in one eye. Dignity not for sale. We've lost control of the narrative." CEO Richard Coleman paced his office, his tie loosened, sweat beading at his temples. "How bad is it?" he demanded. "Sir, it's catastrophic," an aide replied, clutching a tablet. "Live stream viewers just hit 1 million. The markets are reacting. Our biggest investors are calling non-stop." Coleman froze, his face blanching. He knew which investor they meant. He knew exactly who sat in seat 1A. The deal they had spent months negotiating, the merger worth $500 million, was suddenly hanging by a thread. Back in the cabin, Officer Daniels leaned toward Susan Miller. His voice was low but firm. "Ma'am, with respect, if we escalate further, this will explode beyond repair. The passenger has done nothing wrong. Forcing him out would be indefensible." Officer Wright nodded. "We'd be putting ourselves in the middle of a viral storm, and I'm not risking my badge for a mistake like that." Susan's lips pressed into a thin line. She understood now that she was cornered. The authority she had wielded minutes earlier was gone. The cabin no longer belonged to her. It belonged to the truth. Bradley Turner tried once more, his voice desperate. "You're all letting him manipulate you. This is about class, about standards. If we let anyone just sit here, what's the point of status?" Dorothy Hayes turned sharply toward him, her eyes blazing. "Class standards. You mean skin color? Let's call it what it is. And I won't be silent." Gasps spread. A few passengers applauded. Maya zoomed her camera in on Dorothy, her voice trembling. "Did you hear her? She said it. She said what we're all thinking." Malcolm closed his eyes briefly, listening to the surge of voices around him. When he opened them, his gaze was calm, unshaken. He spoke slowly, deliberately. "This is not about one man. This is about everyone who has ever been told to prove they belong, while others are believed without question. Today, that ends." The cabin roared with applause. It was no longer scattered, hesitant. It was unified, thunderous, undeniable. At that very moment, Maya's phone lit up with a notification. She gasped aloud, tears springing to her eyes. CNN has joined the stream, she whispered. BBC is rebroadcasting. The world is watching. The passengers looked at one another, their expressions stunned. They realized they were no longer an audience. They were part of a global broadcast, their every reaction a piece of history unfolding live. Heather covered her face with her hands, her voice breaking into a whisper. "What have I done?" Bradley slumped in his seat, the weight of humiliation pressing down. He pulled out his phone at last, his hand trembling. The screen glowed with notifications. Headlines screamed his name. Messages from his company, his clients, his friends, all demanding explanations. His reputation, once untouchable, was crumbling in real time. Susan Miller stood frozen, clipboard limp in her hand. She thought of her years of service, her belief in order, her reliance on procedure. And now she realized that the very system she had defended had betrayed her. Malcolm remained still, his presence unyielding. He tapped his notebook lightly, as though underlining the word etched on its cover. "Justice," he whispered, not for the cameras but for himself. "Justice is not a gift. It is a right." Maya's camera caught the whisper. Her viewers erupted in the comments. "Say it again. Justice is not a gift. Justice is a right." The storm had broken fully now. It was no longer confined to the plane, no longer a dispute over a seat. It was a reckoning, sweeping across the skies and into the world below. And Malcolm Price, calm and resolute, had become its unwilling lightning strike. The aircraft had become more than a cabin. It was a stage, a tribunal, a mirror reflecting truths long buried under routine and silence. Every light from a phone camera glowed like a star, and together they illuminated the injustice that had unfolded in seat 1A. Dr. Malcolm Price sat quietly, his posture straight, his hands resting on his closed notebook. The word justice beneath his fingertips was more than ink. It was the compass of the moment. He did not fidget, did not flinch, did not falter. His silence radiated power, and the passengers felt it in their bones. Maya Lopez tried to steady her breathing as her phone vibrated violently in her hand. Notifications cascaded down her screen like rainfall. Her live stream had crossed 2 million viewers, the counter racing upward as networks, influencers, and activists across the world tuned in. She wiped a tear from her cheek, whispering into her mic, "The world is watching. You're all witnesses. History's not happening in a courthouse today. It's happening here, on Horizon Flight 227. Dorothy Hayes clasped her hands tightly in her lap, her eyes fixed on Malcolm. She thought of her grandchildren, of the stories she had told them about the marches in the 1960s, about the voices that had risen against injustice. She never imagined she would live to see something like this again, and certainly not in the quiet luxury of first class. Bradley Turner could no longer meet anyone's gaze. His shoulders sagged, his arrogance dissolving into panic. His phone screen glowed with headlines screaming his name, his face captured mid-sneer, rebroadcast on every news channel, platinum passenger sparks, outrage on Horizon Flight. His assistant's messages piled one after another. Clients are furious. The board wants your resignation. Damage control impossible. Heather Collins stood frozen near the galley, her chest heaving with shallow breaths, the words she had spoken. "You don't belong here." "Verify your card," replayed in her mind like a cruel chant. She saw her own face in the countless cameras pointed her way, and she knew, with a dread that hollowed her out, that the world would remember her not as a professional, but as a symbol of prejudice. Susan Miller, still clutching her clipboard, felt the ground slipping beneath her feet. She had come in believing she could control the situation with procedure, with authority. But authority had shifted. It no longer lived in her hands. It belonged to the truth that the passengers had seen, to the man who refused to rise from his seat, to the millions watching through a live stream she could not silence. Officer Daniels exchanged a look with his partner, Officer Wright. Both men had seen fights, breakdowns, drunken outbursts, but what they were witnessing now was something different. A storm born not of chaos but of calm. A man who refused to bend. Daniels cleared his throat, his voice carrying in the tense air. With respect, Ms. Miller, this passenger has shown no sign of disruption. Forcing him out under these circumstances would not only be unjust, it would be indefensible. Wright nodded firmly. We are not here to enforce prejudice. We're here to enforce safety, and nothing about Dr. Price threatens safety. The statement struck like a gavel. The last shreds of the corporate control dissolved into silence. Malcolm lifted his gaze, his voice low but steady. I will not stand, because if I yield today, tomorrow, any one of you could be told you don't belong. This is bigger than a seat. This is about whether silence continues to protect prejudice. The cabin roared with applause. Passengers who had once looked away now clapped openly, their voices rising in support. Maya's camera caught every second, her live stream chat exploding with hashtags, justice in 1A, dignity not for sale, Malcolm Price. Bradley's face twisted with rage and desperation. You're turning this into a circus. This isn't about race, it's about order. Dorothy turned sharply toward him, her voice cutting through the noise. Order built on prejudice is not order, it's oppression. The passengers erupted again, some clapping, others shouting their agreement. Bradley slumped back in his seat, his voice reduced to a mutter, drowned out by the swell of voices against him. Malcolm remained calm, his presence steady. He reached for his phone, tapped the screen, and placed it on the armrest. A female voice came through, urgent and sharp. Dr. Price, this is Elaine Carter from Price Global Communications. We need your directive. Horizon stock has fallen 12% in the last 30 minutes. Major outlets are broadcasting live. Do we release a statement? Gasps filled the cabin. Every passenger leaned closer, straining to hear. Even Bradley, pale and sweating, looked up, realizing the magnitude of the moment. Malcolm's gaze swept the cabin, meeting the eyes of strangers who had become witnesses, allies, participants. His voice was calm but resolute. Release it. Tell the world Horizon Air humiliated a paying passenger, not for failing to comply, but for failing to look like they belonged. Tell them the cost of contempt is a $500 million deal. The cabin erupted applause, gasps, cries of disbelief. Dorothy covered her mouth, tears streaming. Maya's viewers surged to 3 million. The chat a blur of capital letters and fire emojis. Susan Miller staggered back, her face ghostly pale. Heather shook her head in denial, whispering, No, no, this can't be happening. Bradley gripped his head, his phone slipping from his trembling hands. On the screen, a headline glared, Major Clients Cut Ties with Turner. His career, built on arrogance and privilege, was crumbling before his eyes. At Horizon Air headquarters, Richard Coleman slammed his hand against his desk, the sound echoing through the room of frantic executives. We are hemorrhaging value. Fix this, he barked, but his advisors shook their heads. Sir, this isn't a press release problem. This is systemic, and the world is watching. Back on the plane. Malcolm leaned back in his seat, closing his eyes briefly. He whispered softly, almost to himself, but the cabin still heard justice is not a negotiation. It is a right. The words settled over everyone like a verdict. Passengers nodded, some wiping tears, others filming with renewed determination. The storm had broken fully now, unstoppable, sweeping beyond the confines of first class, beyond the fuselage, into boardrooms, newsrooms, and living rooms around the globe, and Malcolm Price, silent yet unyielding, had become its living symbol. The captain's voice broke through the heavy air, calm but edged with tension. Ladies and gentlemen, we've been instructed to prepare for descent. Flight attendants, please ready the cabin for landing in Los Angeles. But no one reached for their tray tables. No one flipped through a magazine or adjusted their seats. The cabin was far from calm. It thrummed with the awareness that when the wheels touched the runway, the world would be waiting. Doctor. Malcolm Price kept his posture straight, eyes fixed on the window. Below the clouds, the sprawl of Los Angeles glimmered in the fading light. He knew what awaited him: cameras, microphones, crowds. The storm had already grown beyond the fuselage. By the time the plane's wheels hit tarmac, there would be no turning back. Maya Lopez's phone buzzed violently in her trembling hand. She whispered into her mic, her voice unsteady. 3.5 million watching now. CNN has rebroadcast the stream. BBC, Reuters, even Al Jazeera. The whole world is tuned in. Don't look away. This isn't just a flight anymore. This is justice at 30,000 feet. Dorothy Hayes clasped her hands together, whispering a prayer under her breath. Her voice cracked, but her eyes never left Malcolm. Lord, give him strength. He's carrying more than himself now. Bradley Turner slumped low in his seat, sweat slicking his forehead. His phone buzzed again, and this time he forced himself to look. Bradley, resign immediately. We cannot defend this. You're finished. The message from his company's board pulsed on the screen like a sentence carved in stone. His hand shook as he set the device down. The platinum card around his neck no longer felt like status. It felt like a noose. Heather Collins stood by the galley, tears streaking her face. She had stopped pretending to be composed. Each replay of her words online, each clip of her demanding verification, each shot of her dismissive glare burned like fire in her chest. She wanted to disappear, but the cabin had become an arena, and she knew she was already a symbol of what millions despised. Susan Miller attempted one last effort to salvage control. She stepped toward Malcolm, her voice hushed but urgent. Dr. Price, if you'll allow it, we can arrange a private exit upon landing, a rear door, discreet, away from the press. We can minimize the damage. Malcolm turned his gaze to her, his eyes calm but piercing. No, the truth does not leave through the back door. The truth walks out the front, in the light, where everyone can see. The passengers erupted in applause, some shouting words of encouragement. Dorothy wiped her tears, clapping firmly. Maya's live stream feed went wild, the chat scrolling faster than she could process. Front door, dignity, justice. Officer Daniels folded his arms, nodding with respect. That's the right call, he murmured. Truth doesn't hide. As the plane began its descent, turbulence rattled the cabin. The rumble of engines filled the silence. But the tension only grew heavier. The flight attendants moved mechanically, but their faces betrayed fear. They knew what awaited them outside. Malcolm closed his notebook, slipping it into his leather case. He placed his hand over it for a moment, steadying himself. The word justice burned in his mind like a beacon. He thought of his father's words, of moments when he had stepped aside, chosen silence, allowed himself to be dismissed. He had always told himself it was the cost of survival. But tonight, survival was no longer enough. Tonight demanded defiance. The landing gear screeched into place. The cabin jolted. Passengers gripped their armrests, not from fear of the descent, but from anticipation of what awaited. The roar of the engines rose as the wheels met the runway with a shuddering crash. Brakes screamed. The body of the aircraft shivered, and then, suddenly, there was silence. The plane slowed to a crawl. Outside, through the oval windows, the runway lights blazed against the darkening sky, but beyond the glass, shadows moved a crowd, flashes, barricades. The media storm was already waiting. "Ladies and gentlemen," the captain's voice returned, unusually grave. "Welcome to Los Angeles International Airport. Please remain seated until the aircraft has reached the gate." But passengers were already craning their necks, pressing against windows, holding up their phones. Through the glass, they saw the flashing red and blue of police lights, the glow of television cameras, the silhouettes of hundreds gathered at the gate. Maya's phone nearly slipped from her hands as she gasped. "Oh my God, there are thousands out there. Protesters, press, everyone. They're chanting. Do you hear it?" She held her phone toward the window, from outside, faint but growing. The chant echoed justice in 1A. Justice in 1A. Heather Collins collapsed into a seat, burying her face in her hands. Susan Miller's clipboard slipped from her fingers, clattering to the floor. Bradley Turner pressed his forehead against the window, his lips trembling. "This can't be happening," he whispered. "This can't be the end." But it was happening. And for him, for Heather, for Susan, the end had already begun. The plane rolled to a stop at the gate. The jet bridge connected with a heavy clang. Passengers sat frozen, breathless, eyes fixed on Malcolm. They knew what he would decide mattered not just for him, but for them, for the millions watching. Susan leaned closer, desperation etched in every line of her face. "Dr. Price, please, take the back exit. Spare yourself. Spare the airline." Malcolm unbuckled his seatbelt slowly, the metallic click echoing through the cabin like a verdict. He rose to his feet, adjusting his suit, his movements calm and deliberate. He looked at Susan, then at Heather, then at Bradley. His voice was steady, resonant, undeniable. "No, the truth does not slip out quietly. The truth walks with dignity. I will exit through the front, with every passenger, under every camera." The cabin erupted into cheers, applause shaking the walls of the plane. Dorothy Hayes sobbed openly, whispering, bless you for your courage." Maya's phone counter surged past 4 million. Her voice broke as she narrated. "He's standing. He's walking out through the front. The world is about to see." Officer Daniels stepped aside, offering a nod of respect. "Go ahead. Dr. Price, we've got your back." The cabin door swung open. Noise from outside crashed in like a wave chants. Cheers, camera shutters firing like gunshots, reporters shouting questions. The chants thundered louder, filling the cabin itself. "Justice in 1A, justice in 1A." Malcolm stepped into the aisle, his leather case in hand. His gaze was steady, his stride measured. Each step was heavy as stone, yet proud as a march. He reached the doorway, paused, then turned back to the passengers. "This is not about a seat," he said, his voice carrying over the roar. "This is about dignity, and dignity is not for sale." The passengers rose in unison, applauding, some with tears streaming down their faces. Maya's camera caught the moment, her voice breaking as she whispered, "Remember this. History is walking through that door." And then Malcolm stepped onto the jet bridge, into the blaze of lights, into the storm that waited beyond. The plane's tires hissed against the runway, a soft exhale that barely disturbed the storm brewing in the cabin. Every passenger remained tense, bodies rigid, eyes locked on Dr. Malcolm Price as though he carried the weight of the world in that quiet frame. Malcolm felt the vibrations through the floor, the hum of engines and life around him. Yet he sat as composed as ever, notebook closed on his lap, fingers tracing the edges absent-mindedly. Justice was not a word to him. It was a mandate. Heather Collins approached once again, her voice a careful whisper that belied the tremor beneath. "Sir, I'm going to need you to follow me. The gate supervisor is waiting." Malcolm lifted his eyes slowly, a calm that unsettled her further. "Heather," he said, each word deliberate, measured, "I'm not resisting, but I will not leave my seat without a valid reason. Not one invented out of prejudice, not one manufactured from fear." Bradley Turner, seated across the aisle, tensed visibly. He had expected a simple compliance, a minor inconvenience for Malcolm to accept, and the flight to proceed as planned. Instead, he found himself on the opposite side of a moral chasm, one he had no intention of crossing. His hands curled into fists, tapping rhythmically on the armrest. The arrogance that had carried him through business meetings, cocktail parties, and elite lounges now faltered under the quiet strength of Malcolm's unwavering presence. The intercom crackled, Susan Miller's voice firm yet edged with hesitation. "Malcolm, please understand, this is standard procedure. I need you to step aside while we verify seating assignments. This is routine." Malcolm's gaze swept the cabin, noting the faces of those recording, watching, breathing along with the tension. "Routine?" he asked, his voice soft but firm. "You call questioning a man's right to sit because of his appearance routine, because a passenger believes he is entitled to my place. This is routine." Heather's shoulders sagged imperceptibly. She wanted to respond, to appeal to authority, to find a loophole in policy that would allow her to regain control. Yet the words caught in her throat. She saw, finally, what the rest of the cabin had seen from the start. Malcolm Price was not simply a passenger. He was a mirror held up to their conscience, a lens magnifying the fragile, unspoken biases they carried within. Bradley Turner's face twisted in anger. He leaned toward Susan Miller, whispering, "I paid for this seat. I deserve this seat. This is ridiculous." Susan hesitated, caught between the demands of a client and the truth glaring at her from seat 1A. She had been trained to de-escalate, to enforce rules without appearing cruel. Yet she felt the weight of Malcolm's dignity pressing down on her, a force she could not resist. Malcolm exhaled slowly, feeling the internal tide of patience and frustration clash within him. He knew every second in this seat was a message, every heartbeat a declaration. Leaving voluntarily under false pretenses would diminish the very concept of fairness he fought for in boardrooms and courts. His mind flickered to the executives waiting on the other side of the country, ready to sign a $500 million deal contingent upon his judgment. Every instinct screamed patience, control, strategy. Every principle whispered justice, fairness, dignity. Maya Lopez adjusted her camera with trembling hands, her whisper now almost a prayer. "The world is watching," she murmured into the mic. "He is not moving. They cannot make him move. Not like this. Not with justice on his side." Dorothy Hayes, whose hands were tightly clasped, spoke softly to herself, unaware that anyone else could hear. "How many times have I seen this? How many times has someone like him had to prove that they belong just by existing? This is not just a flight, this is history." The cabin crew gathered discreetly near the front, exchanging glances loaded with doubt. Heather felt the shift in their energy. The quiet acknowledgement that what they had assumed was procedure was instead an ethical minefield. Every order, every directive they had practiced for years now seemed hollow in the presence of Malcolm's quiet authority. Bradley Turner finally rose from his seat, attempting to assert the dominance he thought his money and status guaranteed him. "I am telling you," he barked, voice rising, "I will not be seated anywhere else. This man has no right to this seat." Malcolm remained seated, his eyes lifted to meet Bradley's, calm yet unyielding, and he spoke not with anger but with the weight of reason. "No one has the right to sit anywhere at the expense of another's dignity. Not you, not the airline, not anyone who confuses privilege for justice. This seat is not a battleground for entitlement. It is a space that should honor fairness." A hush fell over the cabin. Even the youngest passengers, the ones barely old enough to understand the complexities of race and privilege, sensed the gravity of the moment. Every whisper ceased. Every camera phone stayed pointed. Every soul seemed suspended in the same tense equilibrium Malcolm maintained. Heather Collins exhaled, feeling the first stirrings of self-reflection. She realized the irony of the situation she had come into this cabin to enforce order, and found herself confronting her own biases. She remembered her childhood, her family's lessons on kindness and equity, and wondered how she had strayed so far from those teachings in the sterile corridors of airline protocol. Bradley Turner's face reddened. He tried to argue, to reason with logic, but found the words clanging hollow in the charged atmosphere. The world outside, streaming through Maya's lens, was watching every second. He was not only accountable to the cabin, he was accountable to millions who had already judged his actions. Malcolm's mind, meanwhile, wandered briefly to the boardroom awaiting him across the country. The decision before him had shifted. It was no longer just a contract. It was a statement, a principle, a declaration of what mattered: more money or morality, convenience or conscience. Every fiber of his being insisted he remain seated, remain dignified, remain unshaken. The plane's wheels slowed, the engines cooling as the cabin prepared for landing. Malcolm Price remained seated, unwavering, a beacon of integrity. Every glance, every whisper, every camera caught him in this moment of moral reckoning. For the first time in her career, Heather Collins realized she could enforce a rule and still be on the wrong side of history. And, in that realization, the fight for fairness in Seat 1A crystallized into something far larger than anyone could have predicted. The world waited as the aircraft slowed, the city lights of Los Angeles stretching below, ready to witness the landing of a man who had refused to surrender his dignity, even at 30,000 feet. The cabin felt smaller than it actually was. The air conditioning hummed faintly. The only other sound, the subtle rustle of seat belts adjusting and the soft click of luggage bins. Yet it was not the physical space that confined them. It was the moral tension, the weight of every glance, every whisper, every judgment. Malcolm Price had become a pivot around which every sense of fairness and injustice turned, and everyone in first class felt the pressure, whether they admitted it or not. Heather Collins stood rigidly, one hand on the back of a chair, trying to summon authority from somewhere deep inside. Her training screamed at her to act, to enforce, to control the situation, but reality had a different voice. It told her that Malcolm was unmovable, not because of arrogance but because of certainty. He believed in his dignity. He believed in the rules as they were meant to protect, not to punish. Susan Miller appeared at the front of the cabin, clipboard in hand, the carefully maintained calm on her face beginning to crack. She surveyed the scene, passengers leaning forward, whispers exchanging like electricity, phones raised as witnesses. She opened her mouth, but no words came out for a moment. Then she tried again, her voice steady yet wavering. "Price, we need you to comply. There are procedures," and Malcolm's gaze lifted slowly. His eyes were sharp but patient, like a teacher addressing a classroom that refused to listen. "Procedures are only meaningful when they are applied fairly," he said. "When they are used as weapons, they are no longer rules. They are chains." Bradley Turner scoffed from across the aisle, his lips curling in contempt. "Chains. We're talking about a seat, not a revolution." His tone carried the entitlement of a man who had spent decades thinking his comfort was more important than anyone else's dignity. Malcolm's calm did not break, though internally he felt the weight of every injustice he had ever faced in rooms like this, moments like this, where the world measured him against someone else's prejudice rather than his merit. Dorothy Hayes leaned toward Maya Lopez, her voice trembling. "Do you think they understand?" she whispered. Maya shook her head, her eyes glued to her screen, recording every flicker of Malcolm's expression. "They will," she said, "and if they don't, the world will." Inside Malcolm, a quiet storm brewed. He had spent years learning to navigate power without arrogance, to balance empathy with authority. But every subtle glance, every whispered assumption, every microaggression carved into the walls of his memory, he knew he had to remain calm. But the internal struggle was fierce. The question wasn't whether he should fight. It was how to maintain his dignity while exposing the injustice before him. How to turn this moment from humiliation into a teaching moment without letting anger dictate his actions. Heather's voice cut through the tension again. "Sir, please, you must understand our position. I'm only following orders." There was a trace of desperation in her tone, a flicker of recognition that she had underestimated the situation. Malcolm's gaze softened slightly, acknowledging her internal conflict. "I understand. Heather, I understand that sometimes following orders feels like the right path, but courage is doing the right thing, even when the path is difficult, even when you're told otherwise." Susan Miller tapped her pen against the clipboard, her face pale. She had been trained to enforce rules without emotion, to maintain order without hesitation, yet here, in this microcosm of humanity at 30,000 feet, She realized that the rules she loved were meaningless if they were applied without fairness. Her mind raced, considering protocol, considering liability, considering the optics of the cameras now broadcasting the confrontation to millions. Bradley Turner leaned back again, trying to mask his uncertainty with arrogance, but it didn't work. The gaze of Malcolm Price, calm and unwavering, exposed him, exposed the entitlement, the assumption, the centuries of habit that had led him to believe that comfort was his right at the expense of others' dignity. Dorothy Hayes placed her hand over her heart, whispering softly. She'd grown up learning to stay silent in the face of unfairness. But watching Malcolm reminded her that dignity could be a weapon. Too, a force stronger than anger, stronger than entitlement. It was the way he carried himself, the patience in his voice, the unwavering belief that he deserved to be seen and heard like anyone else. Maya Lopez's live stream continued, her voice breaking slightly from the intensity of the moment. "Do not scroll past this," she whispered. "Do not ignore it. This is what courage looks like. This is what dignity looks like. This is what we should all fight for." Malcolm closed his eyes briefly, a deep breath passing through him. He felt the exhaustion from the endless struggle, the weight of being misunderstood, the history of every door that had been closed before him. And yet, he also felt a spark, a quiet, steady flame of resolve. He would not move. He would not bend. Not now. Not ever. As the plane taxied toward the gate, the silence of the cabin was thick with anticipation. Every passenger sensed that history was unfolding not in headlines yet, but in the small, intimate space between rows 1 and 2. Malcolm's internal dialogue wove between anger and patience, between memory and vision, between the pain of the past and the hope of transformation. This confrontation was bigger than a seat, bigger than the airline, bigger than any single individual. It was about the principle of being seen, of being acknowledged, of being treated with the dignity that belonged to every human being. Heather Collins adjusted her scarf again, her hands trembling. She had followed orders her entire career, had enforced rules that she believed were unassailable. But now she saw the flaw in the system, the human cost of rigid adherence without reflection. She wanted to speak, to apologize, to fix what she had unknowingly harmed. But the words caught in her throat. Malcolm's quiet strength left no room for confrontation with noise. It demanded reflection, introspection, honesty. Susan Miller finally exhaled, her shoulders dropping slightly. For the first time, she realized that protocol could be re-examined, that rules must serve justice, not convenience, that the courage of one man sitting quietly could illuminate the failure of an entire system. Bradley Turner shifted in his seat, unease gnawing at him despite his efforts to appear unconcerned. He looked at Malcolm, saw the unshakable certainty, and felt a creeping doubt. For the first time, he questioned whether entitlement alone could protect him. Malcolm, internal battle waging yet serene externally, let a small, almost imperceptible nod escape. He was not moving, he was not bending, and he would not be erased. Every fiber of his being radiated conviction, a quiet storm against the assumptions and fears of those around him. And the plane stood ready to dock, ready to let the world witness the inevitable showdown between dignity and prejudice, patience and entitlement, courage and fear. In this compressed space at 30,000 feet, history was not in a courthouse. It was in row 1, where one man refused to surrender what could never be taken from him. The overhead bins rattled faintly as a turbulence wave passed through the aircraft. It was nothing serious, just a reminder from the sky itself that the world continued outside their tiny, tense bubble. Inside, though, time seemed suspended, every second stretched, taut as a violin string, waiting for a note to break the tension. Dr. Malcolm Price sat in 1A, notebook closed, eyes steady on the aisle ahead. He could feel the subtle vibrations of phones in the hands of passengers documenting everything. He understood what they were capturing, not just his calm demeanor, but the unraveling of an old assumption, the quiet correction of a centuries-old pattern. Dignity was not performative. It was a choice, a stance, a declaration. Every fiber of his being conveyed that he would not bend to convenience, to fear, or to prejudice. Heather Collins shifted nervously, adjusting the collar of her uniform. She had enforced airline rules countless times, but never had she confronted the gap between policy and morality so starkly. The cabin had become a mirror, reflecting not just the injustice of a single act, but the complacency that allowed it. She wondered if she had ever acted out of blind habit, if she had ever chosen compliance over conscience. Her chest tightened with a mix of fear, guilt, and self-reckoning. Across the aisle, Bradley Turner fumed quietly. The man seated before him refused to play the role Bradley had assumed he would, the role of the obedient, unquestioning passenger. Malcolm's calm resistance was not arrogance, it was conviction, a deliberate display of inner strength that Bradley could neither provoke nor diminish. The more he tried to justify his own expectations, the more Malcolm's quiet composure chipped away at them, like wind-eroding rock. Dorothy Hayes, still clutching her handkerchief, whispered to the woman beside her. "I can't believe this is happening," she said, voice trembling. "I've read stories, seen videos, but being here, watching someone claim their dignity in front of all of us, it's like standing inside history." Maya Lopez's live stream reached 4 million viewers by the time the plane had begun its slow taxi toward the gate. She could feel her heart pounding in her chest as she narrated, her voice breaking at times with the intensity of the moment. People are watching this, and they are learning that dignity is not negotiable. Look at him, just sitting there, not fighting, not shouting, just sitting. And yet he's changing the way everyone sees the world in these seats. Malcolm's internal struggle was quieter, but no less intense. He could feel the stakes pressing against him from every angle: the passengers, the attendants, the invisible audience of millions online, the gate agents waiting beyond the jetway, the executives who had been briefed on his impending landing. And yet, within that storm of expectation, he reminded himself why he had to hold fast. His mind flickered to his childhood, to the lessons his parents had instilled. Courage is measured not by volume, but by the willingness to stand when no one else does. Justice is not taken from others. It is claimed through quiet, relentless resolve. He thought of the corporate agreements that lay in his briefcase, the potential billions, the lives affected by his decisions. None of that mattered in the cabin at that moment. What mattered was the principle, the declaration that one man's presence could not be erased simply because it made others uncomfortable. His gaze swept the aisle once, meeting the eyes of several passengers who looked at him with a mix of curiosity, fear, and awe. Some were moved to tears, some were angry, some were simply silent, watching the unfolding testament of integrity. Heather Collins finally spoke, her voice small but firm, cutting through the tension like a fragile thread holding a balloon in place. "Sir, the gate staff is asking you to step off the plane for questioning." Malcolm's eyes, calm and piercing, met hers. He considered the request, the authority it implied, the implicit threat. He could comply, leave the plane, and allow the incident to fade like so many others. But compliance would be complicity, and he had learned, in every meeting, every negotiation, every personal battle, that complicity was the quiet killer of justice. "I will step off the plane," he said slowly, deliberately, but only under my terms, and only with my dignity intact. Heather's eyes widened. She had expected resistance, confrontation, perhaps even outbursts, but not this measured insistence, not this assertion of selfhood that left her questioning her own role in the system she had upheld. Passengers murmured softly, a ripple of approval and shock sweeping through the cabin. Cameras captured everything, phones continued to buzz. Maya Lopez's live stream lit up with messages of support, of outrage, of admiration. Malcolm was no longer just a man in Seat 1A. He had become a symbol, a touchstone for the millions watching. Inside, Malcolm felt the familiar pang of doubt, fleeting but sharp. Could one man really alter the course of so many expectations, so many systemic patterns? The thought tempted him, even as it tested his resolve. But then he remembered why he had learned to sit still, to breathe, to think, to act with intention. Justice was not the loudest voice. It was the right one, and he had to ensure it was heard. He closed his eyes for a fraction of a second, inhaling the recycled air of the aircraft, feeling the soft vibration of the engines beneath him. This was not fear. It was not hesitation. It was the quiet acknowledgement of responsibility. He would not flinch. He would not bend. The world was watching. Yes, but it was not watching him perform. It was watching him act with conscience, with dignity, and with unwavering principle. Heather Collins swallowed hard, the weight of her training and her experience pressing down like a heavy quilt. She realized that this was no ordinary encounter. This was a reckoning, both personal and societal, enacted in the confined space of a first-class cabin. And the question that settled over her like dust in a sunbeam was the one she had no immediate answer to. Was she enforcing rules, or perpetuating injustice? Malcolm lifted his head again, eyes scanning the cabin. Every passenger, every attendant, every camera lens was on him. His voice, when he finally spoke, was calm, unwavering, carrying the authority of someone who knew the value of silence as much as words. We are not defined by the comfort of others. We are defined by the courage we muster when faced with inconvenience, prejudice, or fear. I will step off this plane. Yes, but only as myself, not as an error, not as a mistake, not as someone to be erased. A hush fell that was more profound than the engine hum. The passengers felt the weight of the statement, its resonance. Some teared up, some whispered in disbelief, some stared, frozen in the glow of a moral clarity they had rarely encountered in their lives. For a moment, it seemed as if time itself had paused. The world beyond the cabin had not, of course. But inside, for those in that pressurized aluminum tube soaring above clouds and prejudice alike, a quiet justice had begun to assert itself. The storm outside the cabin might rage, but within these few feet of space, dignity had taken its stand. The plane touched down with a controlled thud. the tires screeching softly against the tarmac of Los Angeles International Airport. The engines wound down to a low hum, a kind of exhale from the metal bird that had carried them all through a storm of tension, both in the air and in the hearts of those inside. Malcolm Price remained seated, his posture impeccable, hands folded atop the leather-bound notebook that had been his silent companion through every confrontation and every whisper of injustice. Passengers around him began to shift, the subtle release of tension betraying the recognition of what had just occurred. Some lowered their phones, still blinking with live streams and notifications, the glow of the screens fading into the ambient light of the terminal. Others exchanged quiet words, hushed tones carrying gratitude, guilt, or a dawning awareness of how deeply they had misjudged another human being. Heather Collins approached with measured steps, her professional mask still in place but the tremor of acknowledgement visible in the corners of her eyes. "Dr. Price," she said, voice soft but firm. "I apologize for the confusion earlier. It was never my intention to disrespect you." Malcolm's gaze lifted slowly, calm but sharp, like sunlight cutting through fog. "Intentions are one thing. Impact is another," he said quietly. "Remember that next time someone's dignity is at stake, it cannot be borrowed, it cannot be negotiated, it must be honored." Susan Miller appeared at the front of the cabin once again, her clipboard now folded neatly under one arm. She had witnessed the entire confrontation unfold, had seen the viral live stream capture moments she wished she could unsee, and understood that her decisions had contributed to a scenario larger than her authority. She swallowed, taking a deep breath, and said, "Sir, the gate security team is ready to escort you if you are willing to comply." Malcolm nodded ever so slightly. "I will comply," he said. His voice carried no resentment, only an unwavering calm that seemed to expand into the space around him. Every passenger who watched understood that compliance here did not equate to submission. It was a deliberate choice made with clarity and power. As he stood, the soft scrape of his shoes against the aisle carpet seemed amplified, a quiet drumbeat accompanying the collective exhale of the cabin. Cameras were still rolling, phones still recording, social media notifications continuing their relentless flow. Yet Malcolm did not flinch, did not speak to them, did not perform. His dignity radiated without the need for spectacle. Outside, a small crowd of airline personnel and airport security awaited, the hum of vehicles, luggage carts, and distant announcements forming a backdrop to the unfolding drama. Reporters with cameras trained on the gate, capturing every moment for the evening news, had begun murmuring among themselves. The story had already spread far beyond the confines of the aircraft. Millions were watching, millions were listening, and somewhere, in boardrooms across the country, the potential financial fallout loomed large. Bradley Turner, seated a few rows behind Malcolm, shifted uncomfortably. He had tried to assert dominance, to wield entitlement like a weapon, and yet now he sat in the quiet shadow of someone who wielded something far greater principle. Turner's face was a mix of shame and disbelief, a realization dawning that the measure of power was not in privileges or status, but in integrity and courage. Malcolm reached for his briefcase, pulling from it a small, worn pen. He signed a single document handed to him by the airline's legal representative, a silent affirmation that, despite the chaos, business could continue but only on his terms. The $500 million contract that had been threatened by prejudice and poor judgment would now proceed. not as a surrender, but as a statement ethics, fairness, and respect were non-negotiable. Heather Collins escorted him through the narrow aisle, a subtle shift in posture signaling her recognition of the man's authority. The other passengers followed, their own movements quieter now, reflective. Some met Malcolm's gaze, offering nods that carried a weight of acknowledgement, apologies unspoken but felt. Every step toward the exit was a lesson in humility. Every glance exchanged a silent reconciliation with their own complicity in the moment. At the gate, Malcolm paused. He looked back once at the cabin, at the collection of faces, at the notebooks and phones capturing fragments of a lesson that could not be taught in any school. "Remember," he said softly, so only those nearest could hear. "Dignity is not a gift you give or take. It is a space you hold for yourself and for others. Protect it fiercely." He walked into the airport concourse with calm certainty, leaving behind not just a plane but a moment that would ripple far beyond the walls of the terminal. Reporters pressed their microphones, travelers whispered into phones, and security personnel maintained their professional composure. Yet all felt the lingering weight of a quiet revolution. By the time Malcolm Price disappeared from view, news outlets had already begun broadcasting highlights, the viral live stream, the confrontations, the quiet dignity that had won the day. Social media erupted with commentary, support, outrage, and reflection. The airline issued statements, restructured protocols, and promised training. But the world had already learned the most important lesson that courage does not roar. It stands still. That strength does not need a voice to echo. It simply exists. And as the sunset painted the Los Angeles skyline in shades of amber and gold, Malcolm Price walked steadily toward the doors of the terminal, not as a man who had won a battle, but as a man who had reminded the world that true power lies not in force, but in dignity, principle, and the unwavering commitment to justice. The passengers would remember this day not for the discomfort, not for the confrontation, but for the quiet man who sat, unwavering, and taught them that some things like respect and human dignity cannot be negotiated. As the plane touched down and the engines wound to a low hum, the tension finally eased, leaving a mix of relief, admiration, and reflection in its wake. Dr. Malcolm Price had shown the world what it meant to hold on to dignity in the face of injustice, to speak volumes without raising a voice. His quiet strength left a lasting impression, not only on the passengers who witnessed it, but on all of us watching from afar. Moments like these remind us that discrimination can happen anywhere, even in the skies, and that courage does not always roar. It can sit calmly, insisting on fairness and humanity. It calls on each of us to reflect, to question, and to act when prejudice rears its head. We are all witnesses to the power of standing firm, and the ripple effects of one person's dignity can touch countless lives. If this story moved you, inspired you, or made you pause and reflect, make sure to hit like, share it with others, and subscribe to our channel. Stay with us, because the next story will continue to explore courage, justice, and the moments that remind us why humanity matters most